All right, and I do believe we are on now. So, welcome everybody to the second consecutive live stream for college basketball DFS. Today, we are going to be breaking down the Sunday slate, which I am actually really looking forward to. I really like the fact that we have an all Big Ten slate. I have been saying for weeks now that DraftKings for these Saturday slates should really split them up by conference. I think that would create a really interesting dynamic of doing it, and you have a lot of interesting ways that you kind of pick and choose lineups, pick and choose contests. And so I'm really kind of excited to see all this, this whole Big Ten slate. I was really expecting them to put the Arch Madness game on the slate. I was kind of disappointed in that. But anyway, here in this episode, we are going to be talking all 6 of these Big Ten games. We're going to break down all of them and tell you what you can expect from a DFS perspective, who we're going to be targeting for a DFS lineups, who we will not be targeting for a DFS lineups, so on and so forth. So very happy that you guys are here with us for this live stream here on Saturday night. This is, I would say, the first comfortable live stream, because last night, if you were there at the start, it was a very bumpy first few minutes as I was trying to figure out my bearings, try to get everything straight down, and try to figure out if I actually was live, because it wasn't actually inherently all that obvious that I was live. So I'm glad that you guys are back here tonight. And I'm hoping that, everything that you guys can get here on this live stream is going to help you guys win some money on Sunday. I don't know about y'all, but I've been pretty much sweating out the college basketball DFS all day for this Saturday. It's a long grind on these Saturdays when they do 3 slates and 30 games. And especially if you're playing a 20 max tournament or 2 20 max tournaments, it's a lot of work to put together lineups for 3 straight slates. So I'm kind of happy that the big time Saturday slates are gone. We got this little mid-sized Sunday slate, and this week it's going to be all the conference tournaments, which is one of my favorite weeks of the year, because generally it's more condensed, like in terms of time, slates during the day, and then a night slate as well. So it should be a lot of fun heading into next week, and really excited about the next week here. And I don't know how you guys are doing. I hope you guys are doing well on your Saturday sweats. The early slate for me was about broke even. I had some really good lineups that just didn't make it all the way to the top. And not a bad slate. The afternoon slate, I got my teeth kicked in though. I did not play Kyle Filipowski from Duke at all, and I deeply regret that. And none of my value plays in the afternoon slate did well at all. The night slate, very much to be determined, but we'll see how that goes. Once we wrap up here, I'm going to see how those lineups are doing. So I see we got a few people in the chat. Happy to have you guys here. Jason, welcome. I'm glad to see you. And Jim, glad to have you back again. I see that we have 2 Big Ten guys in the chat, which is really cool, because I know Jason is a big Ohio State fan. So definitely cool that, you guys are here watching an episode for a conference that you're very local to. So I'm glad to have you guys. Let's go ahead now, and we are going to dive into this 6-game slate. And I need to remember how to share my screen again, and then we'll do that. There we go. So we're going to dive into this 6-game slate. Break it all down for you. If you have not already, please do me a favor, hit the subscribe button. I promise you we're going to keep this great content coming all the way through March Madness, along with a lot of live streams and recorded episodes. So hit the subscribe button for me, hit the like button. It helps the videos get noticed, and I really do appreciate it. And then also, if you want to talk about any of these games, any of these plays, hey, the floor is yours. Put it in the chat. I now figured out a way where I can see what's in the chat. I haven't figured out how to show it on screen yet, but I am able to see the chat, and I will make sure I respond to it here on the video. So, if you guys got any questions, got any comments, whatever, put it in the chat. Let me know, and I'll be more than happy to talk about it and help you out. All right, so let's go ahead and now dive into the Sunday slate, and I'm going to pull my notes up, and I'm also going to start the audio for the podcast version. All right, so game number 1 is going to be between Nebraska and Michigan. This one is kind of an interesting game environment, in my opinion. It's projected for KenPom to be Nebraska 78-72 for a 150-point total, which is pretty darn solid, right? It's a rematch of a game earlier in the season these two teams played, and it was 79-59 Nebraska on their home floor. We've talked about all season long how Nebraska is a much better team at home. So not necessarily expecting them to beat Michigan by 20, but however, this is a Michigan team that you can make me a convincing argument that Michigan has checked out on the season. However, Nebraska is deceptively a good team to play guys for, and against. They have a lot of guys who contribute in a lot of different ways for them offensively. And then on the defensive end, they give up a ton of threes and ton of assists. And on that offensive end for them, they rank in the top 40 in the nation in three-point rate and assist rate. So you're looking at, if we got a lot of threes and a lot of assists on both sides of the basketball, that is a recipe for a lot of fantasy points. So that 150-point total with a team in Nebraska that scores and gives up a lot of fantasy points, this is a pretty solid game. Now, on the Nebraska side, in that first meeting, Josiah Allick was one of their best players, which is not usually the case for him. He played 22 minutes in that game against Michigan, put up 31 fantasy points. Not the highest usage rate in the world, but that's not really what he does, right? Like, he is just a human ball of energy who is going to get every loose ball, every offensive rebound. And it doesn't surprise me that he had a big game against Michigan, because Michigan is a team that does not fight for loose balls and does not bring a whole lot of energy. And, I don't mean to offend any Michigan fans by saying that, but they have not been a team that has made the hustle plays and made the effort plays all season long from the games that I have watched. So it does not shock me that Allick had a great game against them the first time. And Allick is also coming off of a great game against Rutgers, where he played 24 minutes and put up 30 fantasy points. Again, the usage rate is not going to be the highest, so he does have a very narrow pathway to hitting his ceiling, but it is nice to know that he did have a ceiling game against these Wolverines earlier in the season. Now, Keizei Tominaga, aka the Japanese Curry, has been one of our favorite guys to talk about and target all season long, because he's a guy who can just get scorching hot at a moment's notice. And in that first game against Michigan, he was 8 for 14 from the field, 3 for 6 from deep, 28.75 fantasy points. That's pretty solid. In the game since then, he's had one game over 30, but other than that, he's been kind of under his 4x value of what he needs to achieve for that salary. So definitely a boom or bust profile. He is a little bit shot dependent, but like we talked about him all season long, you can be shot dependent when you're capable of getting absolutely scorching hot. And if he does, you're going to want him on your roster. So he's a guy that would definitely be considered for me, but he's certainly not a core player or anything like that. Now, Bryce Williams is a guy that I have targeted a lot this season, not just because he is a transfer from my school, the Charlotte 49ers, who, by the way, won today against ECU, but because he's a guy who can contribute fantasy points in a variety of ways. In the first game against Michigan, he was a little bit of a disappointment with 18 fantasy points, but you look at his game log recently, he's had 2 games of 33 fantasy points in his last 4. He plays a ton of minutes. He doesn't always take the most shots, but he gets a lot of rebounds, has a really high assist rate, and can get you some steals as well. And in a game against Michigan where Nebraska's projected to score almost 80 points, I think it's pretty likely that if Nebraska scores 79, Bryce Williams is having a very solid fantasy. Now, after that, I'm really interested in 2 more guys from Nebraska. Rink Mast has been their leader in fantasy scoring all season long. He's really not the leader in price right now, though, which is I find kind of confusing. But in that first game against Michigan, he played 35 minutes, put up 31.5 fantasy points. That's pretty good. And he's the guy who has a legitimate 60 fantasy point ceiling. He did it earlier in the season against Ohio State. And so you're looking at a guy who has a legitimate 8 to 9x ceiling at a price tag of $6,600 in a matchup against Michigan, where this is a team that is not a good rebounding team. This is a team that is not going to be like super most locked in and giving effort defensively. So Rink Mast, I think, is a really solid play at $6,600. And then we got Juwan Gary at $7,400, who has been their usage leader in the last 4 games cumulatively. He's been over a 21% usage rate in each of the last 4 games, and that's turned into 27, 36, 19, a little bit of a dud there, and then 40 fantasy points. He's taken 12 or more shots in all 4 of those games. I don't know why all of a sudden this team is really playing through him offensively, but 4 games in a row is enough of a sample size to make me think that it is going to continue, and he definitely has a chance at hitting value here in this one. Now, on the Michigan side, I really don't think you can look at their first game against Nebraska, because in that game, Olivia Nkamwa, who is currently out for the season, played, and Doug McDaniel, who is currently active, did not play because he was serving his road game academic suspension that was the weirdest suspension I've ever seen, because, it's not like him being at home from a game is going to force him to study and make better grades. That's beside the point. So anyway, Doug McDaniel is a guy who has absolutely eaten up the usage since Olivier Nkamwa has gone down for the season. And in the last 3 games that he has played without Nkamwa, he has put up a 30% usage rate in 2 of those 3 games. He has put up 35, 29, and 30 fantasy points in all 3 of those games. Excuse me. I don't think Nebraska is generally a bad matchup for point guards because, again, they give up a lot of threes. They give up a lot of assists. So I think this is a really good spot for Doug McDaniel with that high usage rate in an environment that yields a lot of fantasy points. However, because he eats up so much usage, it makes it really hard for the other Michigan guys to get there. So the rest of the supporting cast, Reed, Williams, Burnett, Shetter, Jackson, they have combined for 5 games of 24 fantasy points or more. And none of those games have been over 26 fantasy points in the last 4 games. So let me rephrase it a different way. None of Reed, Williams, Burnett, Shetter, and Jackson have scored more than 26 fantasy points in a game in the last 4 games. That's not good. That's not what we want because 26 fantasy points, that's just barely 4x for some of these guys. So I really don't think this is a situation that I'm really going to target a whole lot unless I'm just trying to game stack and hope that this game goes nuclear. If I were to play one, Reed going up at the center position is not a terrible option. He generally has a pretty high usage rate, but he's very volatile with his foul trouble and whether or not his shots go in. And then Shetter, I'm going to continue to be a Will Shetter truther. He generally plays a pretty solid usage rate. In the last 3 games, he's played 25 minutes or more. But the problem is he hasn't scored more than 17 fantasy points in any of those 3 games, and his salary has gone up to $5,000. I don't get it. I don't get why that happened, but he's a guy that I'm going to continue to bang the drum for as a possible play because I do like what they're giving him in terms of minutes and what he's doing with his usage rate when he's out there. All right, now I do see in the comments, Jim, yeah, glad you are a Michigan State fan. I'm not going to butcher them lately. I absolutely eviscerated Michigan there. I'm not going to say a whole lot of bad things about Michigan State, more when we get to them. So moving on to game number 2. This one is probably the most notable game of the day, considering it's between, eventual 1 seed at the Purdue. This one is Wisconsin taking on Purdue. This one is projected to be 81-70 in favor of Purdue for a 151-point total. This is a rematch of a game earlier this season played at the Kohl Center, Wisconsin's home court, and Purdue won it 75-69. So that was a 144-point total in that one. Not great. Not bad, but not great. Now, on the Wisconsin side, Tyler Wall had a ceiling game in the first meeting. He was able to put up a total of 45 fantasy points, 45.75, 27-5 with a few blocks and a few steals. In addition to it, was 10 for 16 from the field, 0 for 1 from behind the arc. That represents his high for the season. And it was against Purdue. And so is there something to that? I think there absolutely is. We've seen the power forward position kind of have some big games against Purdue, not necessarily like a super consistent thing, not one of those that is on the list of you target this situation every time they're on the slate. There's one of those later, but just, a situation where we've seen guys have ceiling games like Tyler Wall, and I'm certainly willing to go back to it. His fantasy performances in recent weeks have been hit or miss, but the usage has been consistently there. And so if he's able to be as efficient from the floor as he was in that first game against Purdue, I absolutely think Tyler Wall is in a great spot sitting there at only $6,000. Now, here is a nominee for Fantasy Stat of the Day. AJ Storr in the first meeting was able to put up against Purdue 17 fantasy points on 15 shots. That's pretty bad. It means that, he was not hitting a lot of his shots, which he didn't. He was 4 for 15. But it also means he didn't do much for you in the peripheral categories at all. He only grabbed 2 boards and got 1 assist. It's not what you want out of a guy who's $6,700. And it's more of what we've talked about with him all season long. He's a gifted scorer. He's going to have a high usage rate. He's going to have a high shot rate. But is he going to be able to get enough peripheral stats that he's going to hit value for his current salary? And when you look at the games where he has hit value, it's been when he's been good in the peripheral stats. Against Ohio State, he had 32 fantasy points when he had a double-double. Against Rutgers in their last game, had 36 fantasy points, had 19, 7, and 2, along with a block and a steal. So I just think that, you're going to need him to put up the peripheral stats. It's not going to be about whether or not he scores. You're going to need the peripheral stats from AJ Storr. And from what I've seen from him, is there a chance that it happens? Yeah. Is it likely that it happens? Probably not. Now, I'm also not a believer in Chucky Hepburn. I think that he is much more appropriately priced on FanDuel, but I still don't know if I would play him on FanDuel. So you look at it on paper, if you're game log watching, he's put up 28 fantasy points in 3 straight and 5 of his last 6. It's pretty solid. Even his salary is $7,500. That's pretty solid. But here's the downside. He has done it on incredible efficiency. He's been really good from the floor, and he has had a really high assist rate. And it's been, I don't want to say lucky, but he's had a very high percent of assist opportunities that were converted. When he's making the last pass on a possession, the guy's hitting it and giving him an assist as opposed to the guy missing it. So, like I said, lucky is not the right word, but I don't necessarily think that this is sustainable. He's only been above 18% usage once in the last 7 games. That is not something that I want from a guy who's $7,500. Now, does that mean that I'm just going to put a big reg X through Chucky Hepburn? No, I'll probably play him like in 1 or 2 lineups out of a 20 max just because I do know that the ceiling is there and the track record is there. But I'm not a believer in the overall statistical profile. Now, after that, Steven Crowell's got a nightmare matchup going up against Zack ED. I generally don't play bigs against Zack ED because they're either foul magnets or they're just going to really struggle to score against him just because they can get their shot blocked anytime. What I do want to talk about, though, is Max Klesmit is questionable for this game. He left the Rutgers game in the second half and did not return. John Blackwell became the shining star of that game, putting up 31 fantasy points in 27 minutes. Now, I think Blackwell, if Klesmit misses, is a really solid play. DraftKings knew that, though, and they priced him up to $5,500. So I really don't like the price tag. But if we get news that Klesmit is out, which we should because this game starts 30 minutes after lineups lock, if Klesmit is out, John Blackwell becomes one of the better value plays of the slate. And I got to mention him, my guy Connor Essegian is down here at $3,000 even. And if Klesmit is out, you got to feel like some of those minutes are going to go to Connor Essegian. He was one of their best players last year. I don't know why Greg Gard has just completely iced him out this year. Now, on the Purdue side, anytime Zack ED's on a slate, you got to talk about him, right? Now, I will die on this hill, though, that Zack ED does not make a whole lot of GPP lineups of mine. And the reason why is because in a salary of $11,000, it is really, really difficult for him to have games where he hits 5X and 6X. And even if he does, it puts like a huge crunch on the rest of your lineup because he's just eating so much salary, right? Like today in the Saturday main GPPs, you needed almost 300 points to win. And Zack ED takes up about a fifth of your salary at $11,000. So for him to be in a GPP winning lineup, he's going to need 60. Which is not an easy thing to do, especially in a matchup against Wisconsin where he only had 42 in the first meeting. Now, granted, it is a sign of how good Zack ED is that I used the word only and he had 42 fantasy points. Like that's still almost 4X value, but I just don't think he's a great GPP play. If you want to play him in cash and just lock in 45 fantasy points at $11,000, go for it. But I'm probably not going to be playing him in a whole lot of GPPs. Now, Braden Smith was kind of the guy that I liked the most statistically. In the first meeting, he actually tied Zack ED in usage rate. It was 31%. He only turned it into 32 fantasy points because a lot of his assists did not go converted on. He only ended with 3 assists. This is a guy that averages 7 per game. So if he gives you 4 more assists, if guys were a little bit better at shooting on the rest of Purdue's team, that's another 6 fantasy points. That's 39 fantasy points. And you're feeling a lot differently about that than the 32 that he had. Also, you look at what he's done recently. He's been over 40 in 2 of his last 3. I think he's much more likely to make my GPP lineups than Zack ED is. Now, after that, we've talked about this Purdue supporting cast ad nauseum this year. Jones, Gillis, Lawyer, and Kaufman-Wren, if you're playing GPPs, if you're doing a 20 max, they got to make your player pool because every now and then one of them is just going to smash, right? Now, the problem is that it's only one of them usually that smashes, and it doesn't always happen. Now, what we do know, though, is that the first time they played Wisconsin, it was a Lance Jones game. He played 34 minutes, 8 for 14 from the field, 35 fantasy points, which represents one of his season highs. So if I were to play any of the Purdue supporting cast, I'd be most likely to play Lance Jones at a salary of $5,900 that is very reasonable, and I think he's very reasonably priced on FanDuel as well. All right, so that does it for the first 2 games. So I'm going to take a quick little breather here. I came prepared this time. Got myself the Gatorade, if you want to sponsor me, you can. But I do need to snip it off the audio so that way I can record for the podcast, folks. And then we're going to pick back up with the third game of the day. So as I'm seeing the chat there from Jason. Yes, absolutely agree with you. I like Wall a lot, and we're going to talk a lot about Julian Reese when we get to that Maryland game. I think he is probably the smash play of the slate, if I'm being honest. All right, so game number 3 is going to be between Ohio State and Rutgers. This is an interesting one. I think this is actually the sneaky game stack of the day. Okay. This one is projected, according to KenPom, to be 66 to 65 in favor of Rutgers. This is a rematch, though, of game earlier in the season that was 76 to 72 in favor of Ohio State. So KenPom has the game tomorrow projected to score 131. And the first meeting between these two teams scored 148. That's a 17-point gap. So what that means is when you see projections come out, or you see, or you're thinking about value, right? And you're thinking about a 131-point total. Think about what if it were 148? How much would that boost it? That's over a 10% boost to the total. And so if they can do what they were able to do in the first game, a lot of these guys are going to be smash plays. And a reason why I think that might happen is Ohio State's a drastically different team from the last time these two teams played. They've won 4 of their last 5 games with their interim head coach, Jake DeBoer, which, by the way, needs to be a head coach in college basketball somewhere next season. Like, you look at what he's done the last 5 games, that's enough of a resume for me. I think there's going to be a mid-major school that takes a chance on him, and they should. Now, also, it's really hard to base anything off of Ohio State's last few games statistically, because they had Jamison Battle miss a game, they had Bruce Thornton miss a game, and then they had senior night. And so they pretty much have just been jumbling this lineup all up. But you can look at kind of what they've done in a bigger sample size, and you can look at what they did in the first game against Rutgers to get a little better of a read on it. And in that first game against Rutgers, Bruce Thornton and Jamison Battle were their 2 best players. Both of them scored over 20 real points in that game. Bruce Thornton in particular, I do believe he got to 4x value if you go back and check this game out. Yes, he had 41 fantasy points in that game. That's over 5x value for his currently salary. So Bruce Thornton, definitely a pretty solid play in my opinion. He scored 31 fantasy points or more in 5 of his last 6. And as we mentioned, the last 5 have been with Jake DeBoer at the helm. So this offense has definitely gone through Thornton when he has been active with Jake DeBoer as the head coach. And so I really, really do like Bruce Thornton here on this slate. $7,800 is a pretty reasonable price tag. And if you're playing on FanDuel, I believe he's $7,100 on FanDuel. Just remembering from what I was looking at it. And so that's a very good price tag for him. Really do like Bruce Thornton here on this slate. Now, Jamison Battle is a guy that, like, you know, the old meme of like with Shaq from Inside the NBA where he's saying, "I'm sorry, I was not familiar with your game." That was me to Jamison Battle when they played Nebraska, because I thought Battle was just kind of this catch and shoot guy, you know, will get threes, will get rebounds, just a solid fundamental basketball player. What I did not know is that he can actually legitimately be a team's leading offensive weapon. And that was what he was against Nebraska, where he put up 45 fantasy points. However, once Bruce Thornton returned to the lineup, he went back to his usual self as pretty much just a spot-up 3-point shooter and put up 17 fantasy points against Michigan. That game was also a blowout, so he didn't play a full minute load. But if, you know, Ohio State's going to score a ton of points, I think Battle is a really solid game stacking option. He put up 30 fantasy points in the first meeting against Rutgers, was 6 for 9 from 3. I really like Battle as a game stacking option. I think you could go like Thornton Battle. I think you could go Roddy Gale and Jamison Battle. I think that if Ohio State were to score 70-plus points, it's very likely that Jamison Battle is having a good night. Now, speaking of Roddy Gale, he is consistently a high-usage player, and what he does with it is kind of up to him. Like, you don't really know what you're going to get from him. The last 3, he's been pretty consistent, though, between 26 and 29 fantasy points at a salary of $6,400. To me, he is primarily a pivot off of Thornton. If you are worried about Bruce Thornton having a high ownership or having a not, you know, getting in foul trouble or whatever, if you want to fade Bruce Thornton, play Roddy Gale, because if Thornton's having a bad game, it's very likely that Gale is going to be the one leading the offense. Now, I do got to talk about their big man situation. So Felix Okpara had been pretty good in the last few games. Now, he had a dud against Minnesota, but, you know, before the game against Michigan, he had 24 against Michigan State and then only 15 against Nebraska. Well, it was only on 26 minutes. And I just thought he looked good just being out there. But on senior night, they had to start Zed Key because it was his senior night. And Zed Key ended up playing 17 minutes and putting up 19 fantasy points. Zed Key is a guy who has broken my heart multiple times this season because I just want him to be the player that he was each of the last 2 years. And he's just not. He doesn't play a lot of minutes, and he's not super effective when he's out there like he was each of the last 2 years. And so the only thing that like I like Okpara, but if Key's going to steal minutes from him, it definitely limits Okpara's upside. And at a salary of $5,100, we're going to need at least 20-plus fantasy points out of Okpara, and I don't know if he's going to get that if Zed Key is going to play 17-plus minutes. Now, with Ohio State, too, you also need to track the youth movement. Royal and Middleton are these young guys that they're really counting on to be the future. They're going to continue to play increased minutes, kind of like what we saw down the stretch last season with Thornton and Gale. And so if those guys continue to see their minutes increase, they're definitely guys to keep your eye on as we head into conference tournament week as DFS value plays. And then, Jason, I see your chat. I think it would be pretty wise of Ohio State to keep him. I think that knowing the Ohio State athletic department, I think they want to make a splash with their next head coaching hire, but that's because that's kind of what they generally do. But I would be a big fan of them keeping Jake Diebler as the head coach. I think he's done a terrific job in the last 5 games as interim. Now, on the Rutgers side, we got to talk about pricing. So on DraftKings, they have no players that are above $6,300. That's kind of crazy, in my opinion. Derek Simpson was great in that first game against Ohio State. He was able to put up a total of 39 fantasy points on 9 for 16 shooting, but that's not his current role in the offense. Jeremiah Williams, since he has, started playing, has been this team's leader in usage. He's been their best offensive player. And so if you like what Simpson did in the first game, just play Jeremiah Williams because he is now the guy in that role. Now, we got to talk about Big Cliff. So Big Cliff is like a guy who went from $8,000 on DraftKings to $5,700 in one slate. It's wild. It's utterly wild how much of a drop he had. And still, he's only $5,800. He put up 24 fantasy points in that game, by the way, so he was over 4X. And I'm willing to go back to him. I think that it's an utterly absurd price tag. Now, I do want to talk about value plays and ownership real quick. So on the Saturday slate, and I mentioned this to a few people, I thought that Manny Obaseki of Texas A&M was as obvious of a value play as there gets because he had been moved into the starting lineup. He was playing consistent minutes when he was a part of the starting lineup, and he was seeing consistent usage when he was in the starting lineup, and he was not priced up very much at all. And I thought he was just an obvious value play, right? And, you see what he did on Saturday. He had like a 7X performance, and he only came in at like 25%. But yet, like 2 slates ago, when Big Cliff was 5,700, he came in at like 50%. But here's the deal. If you feel like he's a super obvious value play and you play a lot of them, like, I don't think that necessarily like hurts your chances of winning. I don't mind playing chalk value plays because when a chalk value play gets there, you're going to need them in your lineup because most of the top lineups are already going to have that guy in it. So does that necessarily mean that I'm telling you to go all in on Cliff Omoruyi tomorrow? No, but what I'm telling you is he's going to be highly owned, and I'm probably going to play a good bit of him just because of that FOMO of, hey, this is a guy who used to be 8K. This is a guy who has multiple 40 fantasy point performances on the season. His ceiling is insane at that price tag, and I don't want to be left out in the cold if he does, in fact, go off. That's just my personal feelings on it. Now, we can get into the broader discussion of ownership and game theory and all that, but in college basketball DFS, sometimes the best plays are just the best plays, and I think the Big Cliff is one of the best plays here on this slate. Now, for the rest of the Rutgers players, we got to talk about Steve Pikiell and what he said in his press conference and how he followed through with it. So a lot of times you get coaches in press conferences that just have coach speak, right? Where they're just saying stuff and there's no real actionable details. From Eric Musselman is like the king of this, saying something in a press conference and then doing the opposite. So Steve Pikiell, to his credit, said in a press conference that he wanted guys who were going to play with energy and heart and passion. And in their last game, we kind of figured it would be Gavin Griffiths. We were talking about it in the Fantasy Corner Discord, more on that later. And Gavin Griffiths played 24 minutes, put up 26 fantasy points. He's only $4,600. So if Steve Pikiell was going to stick true to his word and play guys that play with energy, you got to keep rewarding Gavin Griffiths, right? And so at a salary of $4,600, he could absolutely come through for you. And then also Austin Williams, or no, it was not Austin Williams. My bad. It was the other Rutgers guard. Jamichael Davis was another guy who saw boosted minutes. He played 29 minutes in that game against Wisconsin, put up 25 fantasy points. So if you think that Pikiell is going to stick to what he said he was going to do in his press conference, Davis and Griffiths are value plays that need to definitely make your player pool here on the Sunday slate. All right, next up, we have Michigan State taking on Indiana. And so this is a very intriguing game, in my opinion, because you have some guys in this game where the fantasy ceiling is through the roof. This one is projected to be 72-68 in favor of Michigan State. Now, what you saw in the last game for Michigan State was the weirdest thing ever. Tyson Walker and Malik Hall both had, I don't want to say ceiling performances, but they were both really good. Tyson Walker, who was only $6,900, he put up 36 fantasy points. Malik Hall was $7,400, and he put up 43 fantasy points. So this was the first game where we had really seen Walker and Hall combine for a lot of fantasy points together. And the weirdest part of it was Michigan State only scored 53 points. So it's so weird that the time that they finally had their together moment was when Michigan State just was not very good offensively, right? So, I've talked about these two guys a lot, of course, this season, but with Walker and Hall, both of them take so many shots. Both of them have shown such an ability to have a ceiling game that they got to make your player pool if they're playing GPPs. Generally, I say not to play them together, but they showed in the last game that maybe they could play together, right? And so with Malik Hall, he did have 43 fantasy points in that game against Northwestern. A lot of it was because he did have 17 rebounds, which is just kind of an insane number. And then Tyson Walker had 21 shots in that game. So there was definitely varying pathways where Hall was getting the rebounds, Walker was taking the shots. That's why they were both able to hit value together. Now, what's interesting is they combined for a 57% usage rate in that game, which is crazy. It's utterly insane. And so you did not see Hogard, Akins, Holloman, like none of the other guys really hit value. AJ Hogard is interesting. I like him more as a game stacking piece because he does carry a high assist rate. He generally doesn't take a ton of shots. Same with Jaden Akins. He's generally like a corner man that's just getting catch and shoot corner threes. And so you want him as a game stacking option, not as a focal part of your lineup. We got to talk about the forwards for Michigan State, though. So it's an absolute mess. Malik Hall is playing the 4, and he's playing pretty much 36 to 40 minutes a game. But the 5 spot, what they did last game was Sissoko started, and then you had Kohler, Booker, and Cooper. They all played the center position. They all combined for 41 minutes, and none of them played more than 13 minutes. It was Jackson Kohler who played 13 minutes. Now, I think this is a situation that you can just totally avoid it and be totally okay, because if they do what they did last game, none of them are going to hit value with them not playing more than 13 minutes. But if you want to make an argument for one of them as a punt play, Jackson Kohler is a low post scorer who gets a decent amount of looks when he's out there on the floor, and at $3,200, he goes in, plays 10 minutes, grabs 3 or 4 boards, has 2 or 3 post hooks that go in. You're looking at a 4X performance. I don't think he's a terrible option. Xavier Booker, super talented freshman. Izzo has said that he is going to play Booker more at the 4. He really hasn't a whole lot. In the last 3 games, he played 17, 12, and 10 minutes. But, if he's going to be out there for 17 minutes like he was against Ohio State, there's definitely a chance that he gets value. But just because I think he's talented, and generally speaking, I'm willing to bet on talent. Now, flipping over to the Indiana side, Malik Renu is a guy that we always got to talk about when it comes to Indiana. He is their usage leader on the season. Unfortunately, he can't stop fouling. That is his kryptonite. He generally has a high usage rate and just fouls his way out of the game. It's exactly what happened against Minnesota. He only played 18 minutes. He only put up 12 fantasy points. If there's ever a game where Renu is able to play and stay on the floor, he smashes. You look at what he did against Penn State. He had 38 fantasy points when he played 35 minutes. You look at what he did against Nebraska, played 29 minutes, still dealt with a little bit of foul trouble, and put up 34 fantasy points. He's got a great ceiling, but the foul trouble is just so real with him. I think he's a guy you can play in GPPs, but he's certainly not going to be a core play or anything like that. If you're a usage rate truther, you got to stick with Malik Renu because the usage is there. You just got to trust that he's going to stay out of foul trouble, which, oh, by the way, he's going to be guarding Malik Hall. So knowing Hall's volatility with Renu's volatility, it's very likely that one of them is a very good play and one of them is an awful play here on this Sunday slate. Now, we do got to talk about Kalel Ware. So this is a little bit of cherry picking, but Kalel Ware owns an incredible stat. He has had 3 of his last 6 games over 50 fantasy points. Zack ED, in that same amount of games, had 2. So Kalel Ware, according to the stats, more likely to have a 50 fantasy point performance than Zack ED, and he is $2,300 cheaper than Zack ED. So he's another guy that, like, if you're playing 20 max lineups, you got to give Keloware some consideration just because he does have that incredible ceiling. Now, I don't really want to bring up usage rates with Keloware. They're generally not like that great, but he's a guy that doesn't need a huge usage rate. He's got a great offensive rebound rate. He blocks a ton of shots. And if he gets you a double-double, he gets you a few blocks, he could very easily hit value for 8,700, or he could give you another ceiling performance as well. So definitely a fan of Keloware on this slate. However, he is not my favorite forward in the 8K range. More on that a little bit later. Trey Galloway actually had a 26% usage rate in their last game against Minnesota, played 37 minutes to 45 fantasy points, which was his high on the season. Look, if that continues, you gotta like Trey Galloway, right? Like, he was able to put up 11 assists, 13 points, 5 steals as well. Now, is that kind of an outlier game? Yeah, but like, if the 26% usage rate continues, we know he gets a ton of assists. We know he's a good shooter. Like, now, when I say he's a good shooter, but like, he hasn't hit a 3 in his last 5 games. But I just think that there's a very reasonable pathway for Trey Galloway to have a good performance at 6,800. Now, I do need to talk about Xavier Johnson, because this guy has cost me some money over the years, but he's also won me some money over the years. So Xavier Johnson played 22 minutes last game. He's played he's played 3 games since returning from injury, 15, 32, 22 minutes. And the usage rate's pretty good. Last game, he had a 21% usage rate when he was in. So if he is just able to go back to about 25 minutes and play at that same usage rate at $4,700, Xavier Johnson could smash, or he could play 15 minutes and put up 5 fantasy points. You never really know with Xavier Johnson. That's part of the fun of it, right? If you enjoy being alive, then you should play Xavier Johnson, in my opinion. $4,700, very good chance of hitting value, very good chance of being an absolute and total bust on this DFS slate. All right, so that does it for game number 4. So we've got 2 really juicy ones to talk about here. I'm going to go ahead and snip it off the audio so that way we can go ahead and make sure we get the podcast audience taken care of. And I'm going to go ahead and get myself a little bit of hydration, because talking nonstop does get to you, believe it or not. However, I will say I'm generally better equipped than most to talk nonstop, because I do teach high school math. So I do get generally used to talking a lot throughout the day. But anyway, let's go ahead and pick it back up. Game number 5. So if you were to target one game on this slate, game number 5, this would be the game that I would be targeting. This is Illinois heading to Iowa City to take on Iowa. This one is projected to be 90 to 87 in favor of Illinois. That is a 177-point total. This is a rematch. The first time these 2 teams played, it was 95 to 85 in favor of Illinois. However, what's really weird is, like, you were probably thinking, like, oh, 95 to 85, that was probably a great matchup for fantasy purposes, right? Wrong. If you were to go down and look at the box score, like, there were not a whole lot of ceiling games in the first meeting. There were not a whole lot of 4x value games in the first meeting. In fact, in the first meeting between these 2 teams, Coleman Hawkins was the only Illinois guy to hit 4x value. He had 49 fantasy points. He was 9 for 11 from the field, put up 32 and 5, along with 5 steals. And he had a 35% usage rate in that game, which is wild. But if we think about what we know about Iowa's bigs, I mean, this is no disrespect. Their bigs are not that athletic. And Coleman Hawkins he's supremely athletic at the center position. He's a mismatch. So do I think that he's going to be able to put up 49 fantasy points again? Probably not. But does he have a plus matchup in a situation where he can be efficient and he can have a high usage rate? Yes, there is absolutely a pathway for Coleman Hawkins to have another ceiling game, and I absolutely think there's a possibility for it. If you look at what he's done in his last 4 too, he's been between 27 and 31 in his last 3, along with that 49 fantasy point performance against Iowa. So I do think he's an elite cash game option at his salary of $7,800. Now, Terrence Shannon Jr. is a guy that we have played a ton this season from Illinois. He is their usage leader on the season. In that game against Iowa, he was not. He was 4 for 10 from the field, 2 for 7 from 3, only put up 21 fantasy points. But the thing is with him is the usage continues to be there. The shots continue to be there. If you're a usage rate truther, you just roll out Terrence Shannon Jr. and trust that he is going to find a way to hit value at his high usage rate. However, I think there's a more interesting play. Marcus Domask has often been the pivot to Terrence Shannon this season. And oftentimes when Shannon does not hit value, Domask does, because Domask is also a guy who can play with a really high usage rate as a ball dominant player. And in the last 2 games, Marcus Domask has only had let me rephrase. In the last 2 games, Marcus Domask has been over a 30% usage rate in both games. He took 16 shots against Purdue, took 21 shots against Wisconsin. So that is absolutely a pathway to success. And if he is playing at that high of a usage rate, it is going to be kind of difficult for Terrence Shannon Jr. to hit value, even though he does play with a pretty high usage rate as well. The 2 of these guys eat up a ton of usage for this Illinois team, right? But if you were thinking, hey, well, why don't I just play them both together? Only twice in the last 8 games have they both hit 4x value or more together. So definitely not a situation where I think it's likely that they both get there, but I do think that you can make a stand and play either Shannon or Domask and be pretty comfortable with it because both of them play with such a high usage rate. Shannon is probably going to come in higher owned because he's the sexier name. He's got more fantasy points per game in his game log here on DraftKings, but Domask I think is a very equally interesting play that's got dual eligibility, and he's an interesting pivot if you think Shannon is going to come in high owned. Now the rest of the Illinois guys, I got to be honest, just not that interested. Shannon, Domask, and Hawkins eat up so much of the usage, and they're all good rebounders that it's really tough for all of them to hit value. Dane Danger might be an interesting pivot. If Coleman Hawkins were to ever be in foul trouble, Danger would be a guy who would get a ton of minutes. And in recent weeks, he had 22 fantasy points against Minnesota, 21 in that first game against Iowa in 14 minutes. So there is a chance that Dane Danger could be an interesting value play, but it would probably come as a result of Coleman Hawkins being in foul trouble. Or just, kind of like maybe even in the first Iowa game, just a result of them being able to have an athleticism advantage down low. I don't remember watching all 40 minutes of that game, so I don't remember why Danger was successful, but I definitely think that he could be a value option, and I'm probably not considering any of the other Illinois guys. Now, on the Iowa side, they're very interesting because Josh Dix led them in scoring in their first meeting against Illinois. He took 15 shots, put up 24 fantasy points. He has generally been the 5th wheel on this Iowa offense, where all 4 of their starters, their big 4, tend to get a ton of looks, tend to get a ton of shots, and Dix is kind of the 5th guy out there, right? And that hasn't been the case in the last 3 games. He put up 24, 23, and 32 fantasy points in the last 3 games on 15, 10, and 13 shots. He's played 34 minutes or more in all 3 of those games. So I don't know, man. Like, if you just showed me name, team, everything else aside, if you just showed me those last 3 games and was like, hey, how much would you be willing to pay for this player? I'd probably have it at about $7K, if I'm being honest. But the fact that he is a guy that over the course of the season doesn't have a great usage rate, doesn't have a great track record, I think it's a tough swallow at 6,500, but there is definitely a chance that he could hit value at that salary. Now, what it also means, if Dix is playing a ton of minutes, Patrick McCaffrey is not playing a lot. He has kind of been the guy that is like, he was the 5th starter before he got hurt. He kind of surrendered that job to Josh Dix when he did miss games, and he hasn't really ever gotten it back. But he is a 3-point shooter who can get scorching hot, and at $4,700, all it would take is 3 or 4 threes for him to hit value, and I don't think he's a terrible option for that reason. Now, the guy that I do like the best on this Iowa team, though, is going to be Tony Perkins. So Tony Perkins is their point guard, and ever since they went to this bigger lineup, he has been their leader in usage. He has been their most consistent offensive player, in my opinion, the least shot-dependent player, in my opinion. Has a high assist rate, will get you some boards as well. Put up 37 fantasy points in that first game against Illinois, which I think is absolutely repeatable, and a salary of $8,100. That's about 4.5x. That's pretty doggone good. Now, Peyton Sandfort has been probably their best scorer this season, but he is significantly more shot dependent. Doesn't always give you big games in peripherals. Only had 27 fantasy points against Illinois. After that, though, he did have 65 fantasy points when he put up a triple-double against Penn State. So he is a guy who has a massive ceiling, but against Illinois, I just don't think it's super likely that he's going to get there. So I'd probably rather just play Tony Perkins than Peyton Sandfort, and there's other forwards in the 8K range that I would prefer than Peyton Sandfort. A guy I do like, though, is Ben Krikke. In that first game against Illinois, he did hit 4x exactly, 23.75 points on a $5,900 salary. And he's kind of like the forgotten guy on this team, but he can have these performances where he kind of reminds you, oh, yeah, he's pretty good as well. He can score the ball as well. And so I definitely do think that Cricky is an option here on this slate. He's been above 23 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. Definitely a guy that is going to make my player pool here at a very reasonable salary of $5,900. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the last game. And some of you guys have probably been waiting for this last game because there's some very juicy plays here in this game. This one is Maryland at Penn State. This one is projected to be 70-69 in favor of Penn State, which is not a high total. But the last time these two teams played, it was 81-75 Maryland in overtime. And in regulation, it was 71-71. So 142-point total, that's not bad. But the good news is more so than any other game on the slate, if there's 142 points scored, it's more predictable to know where those 142 points are going to come from and who are going to be the ones scoring them. These two teams have the clearest paths to usage and the most consistent offensive options out of any game on the slate, in my opinion. And that starts with Maryland. So the last time these two teams played was when I took down the quarter jukebox on DraftKings. I had both Jahmir Young and Julian Reese in the same lineup. And some people might have thought that was crazy, but when they combined for over a 50% usage rate, which they combined for 55% in that game, and the game hit overtime, like that's a recipe for fantasy goodness, is having both of those guys on your team. And so Jahmir Young, he's $8,600 here on this slate. He had 42 fantasy points against Penn State on 7 for 19 shooting, and he's usually a little more efficient than that. So I really do like Jahmir Young. He's one of my favorite pay-up guard options. If you look at what he's done recently, it's been okay, but not great. But the usage is there, the shots are there, and the ceiling is there. So I really do like Jahmir Young here at $8,600. He's probably my favorite pay-up guard on the slate. If he's not, it's another guy in this game. Julian Reese is my favorite pay-up big on the slate. Jason in the live chat hit on this earlier. He is a guy who I'm going to be targeting a ton. He is an elite low post scorer for this Maryland team. The only thing that dooms him is foul trouble, and I don't see a reason for him to be in foul trouble against Penn State. I just don't. He had 48 fantasy points in that first meeting and only had 2 fouls. So definitely what you like to see out of Julian Reese. He is my favorite pay-up big option on the slate. We've talked about a few of the the list of like the flow chart plays this season. Like, I had to be reminded today, guards against Miami is one of them. Centers against Penn State is another one. Like if you just played the center who's going up against Penn State in every game this season, you could probably be pretty profitable on DraftKings. And in this slate, this is Julian Reese, who has a massive ceiling, massive usage rate, and $8,300. I think he's one of my favorite plays on this slate. For the rest of the Maryland team, like it's really hard to get excited about them when those two guys eat up so much of the usage. Dante Scott is kind of like been their third option recently. He's been pretty solid. He's put up 23 fantasy points or more in 4 of the last 5. He has taken at least 9 shots in all 5 of those games. I think he would probably be best used as a game stacking piece. Like maybe you could go something like Jahmir Young and Dante Scott on the Maryland side and hope that Reese gets in foul trouble and it's Scott that they're having to lean on more offensively. I think that could be an interesting pathway to building a lineup. Deshaun Harris-Smith would probably be the pivot off of Jahmir Young, but he doesn't really do a whole lot else outside of score. So not exactly my favorite play there. Jordan Geronimo, the transfer from Alabama, does have a ceiling. He had 29 did I say Alabama? I meant Indiana. Transfer from Indiana there. 29 fantasy points against Rutgers, but hasn't really done a whole lot since. It's really tough to target these two guys when Young and Reese are going to be taking so many of the shots. Now, on the Penn State side, we've talked about them a few times in the last month as well because Kanye Clary was – actually, I don't want to defame Kanye Clary. He's no longer with the program for whatever reason. And so what that has led to is they have just been the Ace Baldwin show ever since Kanye Clary has not been with the program. And he has played all 40 minutes in the last 4 games, which is kind of insane. His usage rate has been supremely high in all 4 of those games. He will get you rebounds. He will get you assists. And I think he is one of the elite guard options on the slate. In the first game against Maryland, you got to keep in mind that in that game, Kanye Clary played as well, and Kanye Clary actually led them in usage. Why am I not seeing this in his game log? Hold on. There it is. UMD. I don't know why DraftKings has Maryland as UMD. So in that game, he was able to put up 26 fantasy points, which is not bad. And that was a game in which Kanye Clary did lead them in usage. So I definitely think Ace Baldwin has a very legitimately high ceiling as well. And I'm probably going to be starting most of my lineups off with one of the elite guards in this game, whether it is Ace Baldwin or Jameer Young. Now, after that, what you have seen since Clary has left the program is there was just this big void of usage, right? And it was kind of unknown what was going to happen with it. Well, Ace Baldwin took a chunk of it. It started out with DeMarco Dunn having a few ceiling games, and then Jameel Brown was coming in and having a few ceiling games. But Nick Kern has also been a guy who has had a few ceiling games, right? He had 36 fantasy points against Illinois, but since then he has not been over 18 fantasy points. Zach Hicks is a guy who has been the most consistent in stepping in. However, his last 2 games leave a little bit to be desired. He's not been over 12 fantasy points in either of the last 2 games. The guy who has been the best recently, though, has been Puff Johnson. Played 18 minutes against Iowa, put up 21 fantasy points. That's a really solid fantasy points per minute rate. Played 33 minutes against Minnesota, put up 26 fantasy points. And he fouled out of that game, so he could have even played more minutes. But he's been the guy in the last 2 that's been the best of the supporting players for Penn State. And I think at $4,600, he is really worth a shot. Maryland is a team that plays at a pretty slow tempo. They're a team that doesn't really surrender a whole lot of fantasy points. But at $4,600, you don't need a whole lot. And both of his last 2 games would have gotten there for you. And he's got dual eligibility as well. So he gives you a lot of versatility in building your lineup. So I do really like Puff Johnson as a value play in this game here as well. And it might sound unconventional, but because, like I said, there's such a clear path to where the scoring is going to come from in this game, even though the total is not as high, I think that there's a very, very sound argument to be made for stacking this game up with 3 or maybe even 4 players. All right, so that pretty much does it for all 6 games, guys. Like that's pretty much all I got here for this slate. Looking at the slate as a whole, like I said, I'm probably, when I build my lineups, not going to start with Zack ED. I'm going to start it with those elite options in the 8K range that we talked about, with guys like Julian Reese, as well as Jameer Young and Ace Baldwin. Those are probably my favorite guys that I'm going to start my lineups off with. And we went over a few of the value plays we like Puff Johnson, Rutgers, Big Cliff, and then Xavier Johnson probably going to cost me some money as well. All right, looking at the chat, seeing if we got anything new. So I've seen it from Scott. Says, any tips on CBB Showdown format? So when you play Showdown, it's not my favorite format for college basketball because I don't think DraftKings does a great job of creating salaries. But what I will say is build with a narrative and run with it. So for instance, let's go ahead and talk about Wisconsin-Purdue, right? So if you were to play Showdown for Wisconsin-Purdue and you think that Zack ED is going to absolutely demolish, then what I would be doing is I would be putting Zack ED in my captain spot. And then, or maybe not, maybe you might put him in one of the other spots, but then I would be building the rest of my lineup around, okay, if ED is going off, who else is going off or not going off? And so you can put ED in and then maybe avoid Steven Crowell, because if ED's having a good game, it probably means he's in foul trouble. But then you could also see hey, who else has their best games when ED has the best game? Is it Braden Smith? Is it Lance Jones? Is it Mason Gillis? That would be what I would consider. I played Showdown today for the Carolina Duke game, and I got my teeth kicked in because I thought that it was going to be an RJ Davis ceiling game, and it was not. It was a Kyle Filipowski ceiling game. But if you want a legitimate path to first place playing Showdown, then what you want to do is pick a narrative, pick what you think is going to happen in the game based off of 1 or 2 players, and then build the rest of your lineup based off of that. And I hope that was able to help you there. I hope that was able to help. But pretty much that's how I've always attacked Showdown DFS. All right, so if there are any other comments, questions, anything that you guys have for me before I end it up here, go ahead and put it in the live chat. Very, happy to have a very smooth live stream tonight, much better than last night. If you were with us at the start of last night, it was kind of bumpy at the start because I couldn't tell if I was on. I couldn't tell, where I was recording, what I could see the live chat from. It was not great at the start, but I got it figured out, and I'm really happy to have another one here under me. I do want to do a lot more of these live streams as we go through the rest of March Madness, because we're going to have a lot of quick turnarounds, right? We're going to have a lot of times where we've got a Thursday slate that's still going on and a Friday slate is starting in 12 hours, stuff like that. So I do want to get more live streams under me. So make sure that you subscribe to the channel for me. We're closing in on 500 subscribers. You can help me get there if you're not subscribed already. And also, please hit the like button on the video before we head on out, because those likes really do help me out a ton on YouTube. They help the videos get noticed, help the channels get noticed. And I really do appreciate it when you guys do that. You guys are the absolute best. All right, seeing in the comments, Jason says, nice show tonight. Thank you, Jason. Absolutely happy to help. And I'm hoping that, all the people who are playing the Sunday slate, I'm hoping that me being able to do this live and get it out to you guys sooner, hoping that it helps you out a little bit. I know it was a really big time crunch when I used to record and process and upload, and it would be going up at like midnight on Sunday. And then pretty much you'd have to watch or listen on Sunday morning unless you're staying up till the crack of dawn. So I'm very, very happy that the live stream was a success, and I hope that it's been able to help you guys. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap it up right there, guys. So thank you guys for joining us here on this episode. Remember, go ahead and subscribe. Go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more of my thoughts on this slate, head on over to the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube, as well as on the audio feed as well. There's a lot of smart people in there who made a lot of money this season playing college basketball at DFS. It's a great community to be a part of. I'll be chopping it up in there all day long, talking strategy, talking plays, and then sweating out together. It's a blast to be a part of. I see a lot of our familiar faces from the comments or in the Discord, and I think those guys can attest to it well. It's a great community, and if you're not a part of it already, I highly recommend joining. All right, so I'll go ahead and leave it off on that note, and best of luck to you guys tomorrow. Thank you guys for watching to this point, and I will see you next time.